Are you sick of always configuring your new machine with all your loved standard settings? Or are you sick of changing things in your Dotfiles configurations and tend to mess things up? I was, and without a clear structure in my Dotfiles, it got so messy after all the time. That's why I decided to change this unspoken lazy habit of mine and create my own Dotfiles Git repository on which I can rely on from now on. Hi, I'm Marco, a software developer and a DevOps engineer at your go-to YouTube channel for all kind of tech-related stuff. If you haven't subscribed yet, now it's the good time to not miss any exciting videos in the future. If you have never heard of Dotfiles before, these are just plain text files in which a lot of programs store their configurations in, and it's just a plain text format. So this is so awesome to use Git as version control system to track changes and store them in a secure place in our Git repository. And if you mess things up with your configurations or want to add things, you can just go back to your latest version, which was working, and then you can use Git to get back your old version. So what are the benefits of putting time and effort into creating Git repository for your Dotfiles and structure them in a nice way? I mean, you can just do it manually at the beginning of your new machine and then just stick to this configuration. And I can tell you that's what I did in the last years, and I can tell you it works. But what do you do if you have a new MacBook or a new Linux machine you want to configure the exact same way as your old machine was? Do you remember then all the settings, all the style settings, all the plugins you used for your shell configurations? I don't, so I tend to spend a whole day to get all this information back together. What plugins did I use? What settings for highlighting, style, and stuff like that. And it's a hassle to use the whole day for just things you'd like to configure and work just out of the box from the beginning on. And yeah, that's why I went through all my settings and decided, okay, I have to change this because now I can just clone my Git repository with all the settings, and just after a little installation script, everything works and everything is as it used to be for me. So, for example, I used to have this Z-Shell plugin manager, which is called Oh My Z-Shell. And before I created my Dotfiles Git repository, I just installed the Oh My Z-Shell plugin manager. And from there on, I continue to manually add my plugins I want to have and all the style settings like power level 10K. But as I said, it's a lot of manual work. So have a look at my old Z-Shell configuration. There was a lot of unused configs, which just the installation of Oh My Z-Shell smashed into the shell configuration, and I just didn't care about all these comments here. I scrolled just down to the bottom and then added my manual work just at the bottom. And I did not care about all the other options. Sometimes when I wanted to add or change some things in there, I didn't even know what was in there anymore. I just scrolled down and said, okay, I don't know what that is anymore. I just add these things at the bottom without taking care of what it actually means. And I was so sick not knowing what my configuration currently looks like. So I decided to create a Git repository, which I can then just put on GitHub and visualize it in a nice way in GitHub or in a code editor. And because I wrote them manually on my own with a lot of structuring in my head, I now know what all these settings are used for. So the first thing I got rid of was the Oh My Z-Shell plugin manager, because it's adding a lot of unused code in my shell configurations. So I went through the process of adding my plugins manually to the configuration with the intention to have a nice structure. This really helped me to keep my focus on what kind of settings do I really need and what kind of settings I really use, and keep them in a nice way in my structured Dotfiles Git repository. And now there's one thing coming into play, which is called a Dotfile Manager, because most of the Dotfiles are stored in the home directory. And then you could say, okay, I am just creating a Git repository in my home directory, but that's a kind of a weird setup, which you usually don't want to have. And some cool developers also thought about these problems, and they developed nice tools for that. And the one I decided to use is called YADM, which stands for Yet Another Dotfile Manager, because there are also a bunch of others which are commonly used, like Stow or Chez Moi, to name a few. YADM basically helps you to organize your home directory with all the dot files in a Git repository without putting all the other folders of files of your home directory in the real Git repository. So that's a nice feature of YADM, but they also added other cool features like encryption or alternate files, which makes YADM able to work on multiple operating systems, for example, macOS, some Linux machines, or Windows. And the best feature they added is called Bootstrap. So with the Bootstrap feature, you can write your own program or your own Bash script or your own Python script. It's totally up to you. And with that bootstrapping mechanism, you can just tell YADM to clone your .file repository on your new machine. And then with all the Dotfiles, you can then start bootstrapping your new machine. So download applications, install them in your binary directory and add them to your path, install whatever you want. And it's basically a complete setup script for your machine to deploy all these little files, dot files, in the correct directories on your machine. And that's the killer feature of YADM in my opinion. So I, for example, started to install my machine with a new Brew installation. So Homebrew is my package manager for all my programs. And with installing Brew on my MacBook, Brew then wants to use Git to clone the Brew repository and use all the installation scripts from Homebrew. But then a MacBook needs Xcode to use the Git program. And Xcode is then installed by the Brew installation. And after Brew and Xcode is installed, I clone my YADM repository, my Dotfiles repository on my machine. And in that I have a so-called brew file. In this brew file we have all these programs I have installed on my MacBook listed in a text file. And then with the installed Brew application, I can just go through all these programs and Brew is taking care of installing all of them. And after the installation process of the bootstrapping is complete, I also have a perfectly working shell environment because all my .file configurations for my shell environment are stored in the right place. So I have all my plugins installed, I have my theme of my shell installed, I have my favorite terminal application installed. So there is barely manual steps we need to do because everything is scripted in my YADM .file Git repository. This is just awesome. And I really recommend you to think of, should I do that or should I not do that? Because when you're configuring then your MacBook or your Linux machine, you really think of what settings do I need and what settings I can get rid of. And you also think about the installation process, because sometimes some shell settings need some programs to be installed or plugins to be cloned in some other folders in your home directory. So you're getting really aware of what my MacBook or machine is actually using. And that's what I really like about the process of creating a .file repository. So as I said, I really recommend doing that. Did you already make the effort of creating your .files Git repository and think of your automated installation process? Let me know in the comments. Make sure to check out my .file repository on my GitHub page, and I'll be making a video in the future about all these little settings and plugins I used, so you can have a look and a feel what my setup looks like and how I also configure different programs. So stay tuned and take care guys. See you guys in the next one. Bye bye.